All right, sorry about that, guys. We had a little technical difficulty, but let's move on in our vocabulary. So the next term you see is the term binomial. Now, binomial is a polynomial with two terms. And the reason for that is the prefix bi means two. So when we have the prefix bi, we know that it's a polynomial with two terms. Now, again, an example of this might be something like 3x minus 2. Right? Or we might have something like x squared minus 4. Right? Those are all examples of binomials. Our next term, trinomial, this is a polynomial with three terms. So again, using that prefix we have there of tri, that tells us that it is a three-term polynomial. And so when we look at that, an example of a three-term polynomial would be something like x squared plus 8x plus 15. Those are things that we see consistently on there. Now, when it comes to determining the degree of a polynomial, we look at the greatest degree of its terms. So what we mean by that is, much like with monomial, we're looking at what is the biggest exponent that we have. So the greatest degree of its terms. So an example, just to kind of line that out a little bit easier, right? And is we might have something like x squared plus 3x plus 2. Now, when we have that, we look at these and say, which one of these terms has the biggest exponent? Well, that's the x squared, so that would be our degree. So when we're talking about degree of a polynomial, we're looking at all of our terms and figuring out which one has the biggest exponent. And then our last term on this first page is standard form. Now, standard form is just a polynomial written where the exponents of the terms decrease from left to right. So they're going to get smaller moving from left to right. It's also known as descending exponent order. All right? So it's just important to remember that the terms decrease from left to right. So when I'm doing this, right, an example of this, what you're going to normally see is something like this. Ax squared plus bx plus c, that's kind of known as standard form. But A, B, and C are just placeholders for numbers, so let's do one with a number. And so we'd say something like x squared plus 8x plus 15. Right, that would be an example of a polynomial written in standard form. The biggest exponents on the left all the way down to no exponent on the right. Now, we always again move from largest exponent to the smallest. We also always put the variables, right, first, moving to the number at the end. If it's just a single number, it should always be at the end. Numbers should always be at the end. All right, oops, sorry about that. Couldn't quite see that. So there we go. That's what I was talking about. So if you flip it over your page, we've got a couple of more vocabulary words that we want to cover before we go on to our first lesson. So the last words that we want to cover, the first one is leading coefficient. And the leading coefficient, we learned about coefficients in the past. That's a number in front of a variable, and it's multiplying the variable. The leading coefficient is the coefficient of the first term of the polynomial when it's written in standard form. So it has to be the first term, and the polynomial has to be in standard form. So again, moving from greatest exponent to smallest exponent. So an example of this would be something like 2x squared plus 8x plus 3. There's our polynomial. And that number right there in front, that 2, would be called our leading coefficient because our polynomial's in standard form. And so the number in front of that first term would be the leading coefficient. And then our last term that we're going to talk about is what's called factored form. And factored form is a polynomial written as a product of two factors. Well, again, product means multiplication. We've talked about that a whole bunch to this point. So talking about product. So an example of a factored form of a polynomial might be something like x plus 2 in parentheses, and then parentheses again, x plus 1. Now again, we're going to go over how to do all of these things, how we arrive at them, but we just want to make sure that we have an idea of what we're even looking at before and the terms that go along with that. So those are all the terms that we'll cover in these first 6 lessons or so. And so make sure you've got some notes on those. Anything you heard me say or you saw me write down would be a good idea to write on your paper. But otherwise, you should have what you need to continue on to the first lesson.